From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Guy Lamolinar from the Center for the Book, which is co-sponsoring our program today. The Center for the Book, for those of you unfamiliar with us, is a section of the library that promotes books, reading, library, and literacy. And we do this here in Washington, and we do it on a nationwide basis because we have a state center for the book in every state in the District of Columbia, and we even have our most recent state center for the book, which is in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we also have a partnership with more than 80 like-minded organizations that also promote literacy like we do. And one of the things that the Center for the Book does is we play an important role in the National Book Festival. We're the office that invites the authors and organizes the authors' programs, and we've done that since the beginning in 2001. And I urge you to all come to this year's National Book Festival, which is September 21st and 22nd on the National Mall. We'll have more than 100 authors there, and if you go to our website at loc.gov/bookfest, you can see all the authors who are coming this year. Before we get started, I just need to ask if you could please turn off all your electronic devices. And I need to tell you that we will be recording today's event for later webcasting. So if you ask a question, you will probably become part of our webcast today. And speaking of our webcasts, they're all available online. So if there are any author events we've had in the past that you'd like to see, you can see them at read.gov. We have more than 200 available on that site. I want to also let you know that the book today that we'll be discussing is for sale at the end of the program, and the author will also be signing his book today. We are often asked by authors and others how we determine which books we will feature in our series, and really the most important decision and criterion is that the book be based on research done here at the Library of Congress. And today's book is on Robert Todd Lincoln, whose papers are in our manuscript division, and I want to thank the manuscript division for bringing the program to us today. The division's Civil War and Reconstruction specialist is Michelle Kroll, who will introduce our author. Michelle has a BA in history from the University of California at Riverside and an MA and PhD in history from the University of California at Berkeley. She's the author of several articles and books on topics relating to the Civil War, as well as Quantico, Virginia, and the World War II Memorial here in Washington. She has worked as a library assistant at the Historical Society of Washington and an assistant professor at Northern Virginia Community College and as a research assistant for historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. And I think the neatest thing about Michelle that you would like to know is that she is in the credits for the film Lincoln as a historical consultant. So please welcome Michelle Kroll.
Welcome to the Library of Congress, and thank you for coming today. If you ask the man on the street to identify Robert Todd Lincoln, he might be able to tell you that he was Abraham Lincoln's son and was slapped by his father in the recent Spielberg movie Lincoln, which Jason will tell you that didn't actually happen. Everything in film is wrong. No, not everything. The slightly better informed might know that he had his mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, committed to a mental institution in 1875. Only the really informed might be able to offer that Robert Lincoln was a successful Chicago attorney, served as Secretary of War, was the American minister to Great Britain, or was the president of the Pullman Palace Car Company. The order of those responses gives you an idea of why Jason Emerson's recent biography of Robert Lincoln is titled Giant in the Shadows. Very accomplished in his own right, Robert Lincoln also lived his life in the shadow of his famous parents. Here at the Library of Congress, we also know Robert Lincoln and his family as generous donors of many priceless manuscripts and three-dimensional objects. Robert's daughter Mary Isham donated the contents of Abraham Lincoln's pockets on the night he was assassinated at Ford's Theater, some of which are currently exhibited in our The Civil War in America exhibition over in the Jefferson Building. And the manuscript division would not have one of the most significant collections of Abraham Lincoln papers in the world had Robert Lincoln not agreed to donate his papers in 1919. Yet even the Lincoln manuscripts we value so highly reinforce the difficulty for Robert Lincoln to be his own man. At the public opening of the Abraham Lincoln papers on July 26, 1947, just 66 years next week, Norman Frost, Robert Lincoln's former secretary and attorney, explained that there was a man who longed to be an individual, but who at the same time had a complete and self-sacrificing devotion to his famous father. He wanted to be known for himself alone, but that wasn't possible. The papers never permitted that. However, with his new book on Robert Lincoln, Giant in the Shadows, which you've seen Guy hold up, and here it is, The Life of Robert T. Lincoln, historian Jason Emerson brings Robert's life out of the shadows and into his own spotlight. Jason is well qualified to present another member of the Lincoln family in a new way, having previously written or edited books on Abraham Lincoln's relationship with science and technology in Lincoln the Inventor, and Mary Lincoln's famous insanity case in The Madness of Mary Lincoln. Incidentally, Jason discovered letters that Mary Lincoln wrote during her insanity episode among the papers of Robert Lincoln's other secretary, and successfully urged Frederick Towers' heirs to donate them to the Library of Congress, which they did. So our thanks to Jason for this important acquisition to the manuscript division. Jason is also the author of numerous articles relating to Lincoln studies and can be found on television and online, providing insights on the Lincolns in his many interviews and public presentations, including those for the History Channel and CNBC's Treasure Detectives. His next book will be a compilation of Mary Todd Lincoln's unpublished letters, which updates a 1972 edition by Justin Turner and Linda Levitt Turner. But today is all about Robert Todd Lincoln, so please join me in welcoming Jason Emerson to discuss this giant in the shadows.
Oh, thank you very much. I sound pretty cool when you say it like that. I will issue a caveat right now. My name is not in the credits for the Lincoln movie, so I don't like it. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a great movie. Everything about Robert in it is wrong, but I'll explain that later. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming, especially on this wonderfully, roastingly hot day. I'm from upstate New York, so this is really killing me. Well, I think most people who know much of anything about Abraham Lincoln, which is many people, they know that he is one of the most written about people in world history. Last I had heard, he was number 3. Number 1 was Jesus Christ. Number 2, Napoleon, which I actually was surprised by. And number 3 is Lincoln. Now, anyone who's read anything about Lincoln, you may know the reputation of his oldest son, Robert. Robert stood apart from his family. He was more Todd than Lincoln. He was embarrassed by and scornful of his father. He hated his mother. He knew little about his father's presidency. He cared even less. He had his mother committed to an insane asylum out of greed and embarrassment. He corrupted his father's legacy. He destroyed papers. He was a cold, heartless, avaricious, arrogant, aristocratic man who despised those people that he considered to be beneath him. This is the typical understanding and belief of Robert Lincoln, and it's in just about any book you find. That's how he is portrayed, and it is certainly not flattering. It's also not true. Don't worry. A lot of people seem concerned and say, well, why did you write about him? Robert was actually none of these things. He was, in my opinion, a great man who inherited many of his father's best traits, and he very faithfully and heroically preserved his father's legacy for more than half a century. But Robert not only protected his father's history, but he made his own history separate from his parents. That is worthy of its own study, of course, I think so. So I actually spent my new book, I spent 10 years working on this. Now I call this my magnum opus. For many years I called it the albatross around my neck that I never thought I would finish, but I did. But knowing that Robert's reputation is so negative, how has his family role become so perverted? How has this good man become the Lincoln family villain? and he is in many books and movies literally a mustache-twirling villain. Now, there are really three specific reasons for Robert's terrible reputation, which, of course, I'm not going to tell you right now, but in a few minutes I'll explain it. Now, Robert Lincoln was the oldest of Abraham and Mary's 4 sons, and he was the only son to live to maturity. He graduated from Harvard. He served on Ulysses S. Grant's staff during the final months of the Civil War, and afterward he became a lawyer in Chicago. And actually, he ultimately became one of the most prestigious attorneys, not only in Chicago, but in the Midwest. He accepted various civil service positions in the U.S. government, including Secretary of War, Minister to Great Britain, and he became a true captain of industry, not only as president of the Pullman Company, but he was also either president or a board member of telephone companies, railroad companies, electric companies, even automobile companies. He was a family man, a businessman, and a philanthropist. He was a self-made man who actually died a multimillionaire. Now, Robert T. Lincoln, he actually never used his middle name, only his middle initial, just like his mother never used Todd in her name. That's something that later historians did. Robert was also the preserver, protector, and defender of his father's ever-growing reputation, as well as the owner of all of his father's papers, which are now in the library, and all of his father's personal artifacts. And in that capacity, which Robert never flaunted, he was besieged by historians, collectors, museums, historical societies, politicians, and the general public, all of them seeking souvenirs, access, some sort of contact with the last surviving link to the great emancipator. And in fact, pretty much from the day after the assassination in 1865 until Robert's death in 1926, literally every single day, he would have people come up to him or write him letters, later on call him on the telephone. And imagine this for 60 years, every day, people, can you tell me about your father? Do you have anything from your father? Can you look at this book I wrote about your father? Can you look at this poem? Can you look at this painting? Can you look at this bust? Every day. By 1909, the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, Robert was receiving more than 100 letters a day about his father. And he answered them all, which is pretty heroic. Well, he didn't, his secretary did, but he made sure they were answered. Now, Robert's attitudes toward his father's papers and artifacts was consistent for, 60 years. Basically, he never let anyone look at them, except for Nicolay and Hay, which I'll get to in a minute. But basically, his relationship with his father's legacy was much more complex than just owning or not owning these papers. He revered his father's legacy and his father's memory, and he believed very much in the hagiographical style of biography at the time. People are just clamoring to listen to me speak. It's wonderful. Robert believed basically, biographies way back when were, he's a great man, we show all the great things. And anything that's really not that great or might be embarrassing, we just kind of, brush that aside. That's really not that important. And Robert believed in that. He believed in the purity of his father's memory. But Robert was, in fact, very publicly reticent, and he did not like to speak about his father. He never wanted to insert himself into his father's legacy. But as Robert aged, his patience thinned a bit, and as he got older, he eventually became a little bit more outspoken for the purity of his father's memory. But Robert, as the only surviving son of Abraham Lincoln, he did not allow his father's legacy or memory to control his life, although it certainly imbued it. He never traded on his name, although others did trade for him. He did not seek publicity or public adoration, but such exposure was often thrust upon him. Nor did he, as many people have believed, live under an inferiority complex due to his father's apotheosis and the expectations of the general public, although such judgments were often made about him. But Robert's life is really a fantastic journey through an amazing period in American history. He was born in 1843 in a 1.5 story room, no running water, outdoor bathrooms, horses, dirt streets. And he died in 1926 in a 25-room Georgian Revival mansion in Vermont with a car in the garage and a granddaughter who flew airplanes. And Robert saw all of this growth of America. But his life has really been unexamined. Before my book, there was only ever one biography of Robert ever written in 1969 by a man named John Goff, and it's called Robert Todd Lincoln, A Man in His Own Right. And Goff's book is pretty good. It's 286 pages. It's very general. But it really wasn't his fault. When he was writing this, Robert's grandchildren were still alive, and they would not allow Goff to look at their family papers. So Goff did really well with what he had, but what he had really wasn't a whole lot. Now, the other book, there's kind of a sort of biography. It's called Lincoln's Sons by Ruth Painter Randall, and that was published in 1955. And that's about all 4 Lincoln boys, but since Robert was the first and the last and lived the longest, much of the book is about him. And that's pretty good. Both of those books are a good starting place. But more information is definitely needed to really understand Robert's life and who he was. But because he was Abraham Lincoln's son, unfortunately, Robert has long been subsumed under the Lincolniana heading. But more than that, for decades, certainly as long as I've been studying Lincoln for 20 years, Robert has typically been ignored, often misunderstood, and usually maligned by Lincoln scholars. And this is really what drew me to the study of Robert. I've been, as I said, studying Lincoln and his family for about 20 years. I started in 94 when I worked at the Abraham Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois. And during that time, since that time, I've read hundreds, thousands probably of books and articles and newspapers and things. And I've developed kind of a predilection for books and things that I research and write about. I prefer that they haven't been written about 1,000 times. So I always tell people, I will never write a biography of Abraham Lincoln because there's plenty. And if I ever do, call me on it. I'll give you a free copy of the book, since I broke my word. But, so as I was started my writing, I first did a couple of articles about Abraham Lincoln's poetry, which he was actually a pretty good poet. And it's never really been written about. So I did that. I studied his invention and patent, which was my book, Lincoln the Inventor. Mary Lincoln's insanity case, only one book had ever been done about that. And I found lots of new items and new letters. And ultimately, somehow I stumbled upon Robert Lincoln. And I went to his house, Hildene, in Manchester, Vermont, which is a wonderful place. I highly recommend it if you ever go up that way. And I picked up John Goff's book. I don't really remember reading it, but I know I did. And at some point, I wish I could remember where, because people always ask me, but somewhere I learned that the Republican Party tried 5 times to get Robert Lincoln to run for president of the United States. And every time he said no, he wanted nothing, absolutely nothing to do with it. In 1887, when he came dangerously close in 88 of being nominated against his will. But in 1887, he very famously said, "The presidential office is but a gilded prison. The care and worry far outweigh, to my mind, the honor which surrounds the position." Well, they kept trying. In 88, one of my favorite things, the Republicans, they had lost in 84 to Grover Cleveland, so they were desperate to get the White House back, and they thought, what are the 2 biggest names in the Republican Party? Lincoln and Grant. So they wanted to run Robert Lincoln for president and Frederick Grant, the son of U.S. Grant, for vice president. Of course, neither one of them wanted to run, so that didn't really work, but they tried. But I thought that was fascinating, so I wrote an article about Robert's being a non-presidential candidate, and it was published in American History magazine, which was my first break into the slicks. I actually got paid for it, which was a nice change as a scholar. But as I was doing research for that, I kept finding all these fascinating things that I had never known and never seen published. My next article, I learned a story, some of you may have heard it, that in 1863, when Robert was a college student, he was almost killed by a train. And the man who saved his life was named Edwin Booth, the older brother of John Wilkes Booth, which is a fascinating story. So I wrote an article about that. And as I was researching that, I just kept finding all this great stuff and kept churning out all these articles. And one day I thought, I should probably just write a book about Robert instead of all these articles. And so I did. Silly me. What I learned very quickly, as I mentioned before, was that Robert's life has really been ignored, disregarded, misunderstood, maligned by historians. And as a result, nobody has ever looked through Robert's papers, which is amazing considering that he was the oldest son, the only son to survive, and he owned the papers, his father's papers, for 60 years. But and it surprised me because even if Robert is only a minor character in the Lincoln story, which a lot of people think, you would think that you would at least go to his papers because he was more or less a grown man when his father was in the White House. You'd think you'd want to know what the son knew. And yet, no one's ever bothered to look at Robert's papers. And it's, as a historian, it's simultaneously depressing and exciting. As I was doing my research for 10 years, research and writing, every single day, I found something new, unknown, unpublished, not just about Robert, but about Abraham, about Mary, about the Civil War, about his time in the White House, about Robert's kids, his grandkids. It was amazing, the things and a lot of this stuff I had to really dig out, but a lot of it was right there in the open that just nobody had ever cared to look for. One of the major discoveries that I made was really Robert's relationship with his father. Now, if you've seen the Lincoln movie, that movie portrayed Robert exceptionally well in the completely misguided, misunderstood, and incorrect way that I've been talking about. The typical understanding is Robert and he and his father, they didn't get along, didn't like each other. Robert was never in the White House, and they just, he was a Todd, he wasn't a Lincoln, and they just clashed heads. The famous scene where Lincoln slaps him, which is utterly ridiculous. But what I discovered during my research was that, Robert was at Harvard College during the war. So everyone said, well, he was never around, so why would he know what happened in the White House? Well, actually, Robert was in the White House constantly. Every break from school he had, summer, winter, spring, he went to the White House. Almost practically every weekend, every other weekend, he took the train, went to the White House. And not only were he and his father close, but what I discovered that Robert was actually his father's confidant during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln confided in his son in some of the most trying times of the war, including the cabinet crisis of '62, the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg in '63, the issuance of the Pomeroy Circular in '64, the Hampton Roads Peace Conference in '65. Robert actually once lamented to a friend that he kept no notes during the war. He wrote, "It's a very great regret to me that I did not do so, because on several occasions my father, in his desire to unburden himself to someone in whom he had complete trust, gave me statements of the conditions of things which were very much troubling him, and I ought to have jotted them down." But actually, Robert did jot them down, just not in a diary, but in numerous letters to various people throughout the years, which are spread across America, which this is why it took me 10 years to write the book, one reason. But, every day I found something new, and a lot of things I found here in the Library of Congress, my favorite place to research. I think I must have looked through, 2 or 3 dozen collections of papers here in the manuscripts reading room, and in the newspaper microfilm room, and in the law library, and in the photo room. So I basically lived here for a few years. Now, people often ask me, what's the best thing you found? You say you found all this great stuff. The best thing I ever found, I actually found here at the Library of Congress, and I had to keep it a secret for about 6 years. It was killing me. And the Robert Todd Lincoln papers, not his father's papers that he donated, but Robert's papers. Way back when, I think it was 2 folders. And so I'm just looking through it and just looking through the few things in there, and I find this, I think it was 12-page handwritten letter dated July 12, 1881. Robert was Secretary of War under President Garfield, and he was 40 feet away when Garfield got shot. And so I found this letter, and it's detailing day by day, some cases minute by minute, everything that happened from the moment Garfield got shot for the next 7 days in the White House. What Garfield was doing, how he was feeling, what the doctors were doing, what they were saying, how the government was being run. Robert and Secretary of State James G. Blaine basically ran the government for that, especially for that week. And it was just an absolute goldmine of information. And I've looked at everything ever written about Garfield. Nobody has ever used it. And so, people say, "Oh, you find anything interesting at the library today?" No. I didn't look at Robert's papers today, by the way. It was incredible. And I actually found about 6 letters that Robert wrote about the assassination that nobody's ever used. And one thing I discovered, which was amazing, as I was writing about Garfield's assassination, during the trial of Guiteau, the prosecution called to the stand to testify every single person who was in the train station, the Baltimore train station, the moment Garfield got shot. Every single person, except for Secretary of War Robert Lincoln, who was standing 40 feet away. And I honestly don't know why. It's a wonderful and infuriating mystery to me why they didn't call him. I can only assume, at the time, everybody, can you believe it? Robert Lincoln, first his father, then he's standing next to Garfield. What a horrible thing. And, maybe the court didn't want to put him through testifying. I don't know. But yeah, so he never testified. So I don't know. Maybe that's why everybody thinks that he knew nothing about the assassination. But the odd thing is that a couple of nights before the assassination, Garfield sat down with Robert Lincoln, had a cigar, and asked him very kindly, but asked him if he would relate to Garfield, if Robert would relate to Garfield, the day of and the night before his father died, and what his father was doing right before he died, which is kind of eerie in its own way. Now, I could tell you so many stories about interesting things I found, but one thing that I find people have a lot of questions on, and it's very fitting because we're in the library, is the fact that Robert had all of his father's papers for 60 years. You know, there's been a lot of stories that Robert burned papers, he purged the papers, he edited the papers, et cetera, et cetera. What was fascinating to me, which I never knew, was that, so after the assassination, Abraham Lincoln's two secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, and Robert Lincoln, they all went to the White House and they boxed up everything in the Oval Office. And they sent all, I think at the time it was 11 trunks, to the bank vault of David Davis, Abraham Lincoln's friend, and at that time a Supreme Court justice. And Robert's idea, Robert was the man of the family now, he was the oldest, was we'll leave him there for a while until Nicolay and I can go through it, and probably David Davis, and we'll see what's good, what's bad. Anything purely personal to the family will not be released to the public, but everything else, we'll release it and let people see it. So 9 years later, Robert still had not gone through the boxes. John Nicolay and John Hay, they wanted to write what they wrote was a 10-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln, the definitive account, and they wanted to look through the boxes. And Robert said that they could. He said, but first let me go through them and make sure there's nothing embarrassing in there, anything purely private. But Robert just kept procrastinating because he wrote many times. He said, I know the minute I open those up, I will be deluged with requests. Everybody's going to want to see what's in the boxes. So finally in 1874, Nicolay was just harassing him. So Robert, he had some boxes sent to his Chicago home. He opened up the first box, just if you can imagine, just thousands of papers in there. And he just thought, boy, Nicolay, you just go ahead and take them. He just let him take them. So Nicolay brought them to Washington, and he kept them mostly under the U.S. Capitol building. He was the Marshal of the U.S. Supreme Court. So he and Nicolay wrote their book, and Nicolay kept the papers in his possession until he died in 1901. After that, John Hay was then Secretary of State to President Theodore Roosevelt. He took the papers, put them in the vaults under the State Department. And then he died in 1905. So Robert Lincoln came to Washington and took possession of his father's papers, which he had not seen in 30 years. And so, people who say, oh, Robert purged the papers and he burned them and this and that. Robert he didn't have them in his personal possession until 1905. So, he was trying to decide, of course, everybody wanted the papers. And in the end, he decided to donate them to the Library of Congress in 1919, although they weren't brought here until 1923, I believe it was, for the benefit of the people of America, which is amazing. But, the most famous story about Robert burning papers, some of you may have heard or seen it, was that one of Robert's friends was Nicholas Murray Butler. He was the president of Columbia University. And in his memoirs and in, I think, Life magazine article, he wrote this wonderful article about how he got this frantic call one night from Robert's secretary, I think, or one of Robert's friends. I was just over at Hildene and Robert Lincoln is burning his father's papers. You're the only one that he'll listen to. You run over there. And so Butler runs over there. Stop what you're doing. How dare you? And he dresses Robert Lincoln down. Those don't belong to you. They belong to America. You give those to the Library of Congress right now. How dare you? And Robert, oh, you're right. I'm sorry. That's a wonderful story. And Butler was adamant. This happened in 1924. Absolutely. Really? Well, Robert gave the papers away in 1919, so I don't know what you're talking about. But people look at that story, oh, see, Robert burned papers. But actually what we know is that Robert burned a lot of his own papers. He was a quintessential Victorian-era gentleman, and he believed very deeply in privacy, manly duty, manly honor, but family privacy. And so I know he burned some of his mother's papers. He burned a lot of his own papers that were just private. He didn't want anybody to see. But so I think that those are where some of those stories come from. So he never burned any of his father's papers that I'm aware of, but it's still, it's a fun story. I could tell you stories all day, but I'll end with one last one. One of my favorite stories I ever read after Robert died, it was in one of his obituaries. His friend F. Willis Rice, who was a member of the Chicago Club with Robert. Robert lived in Chicago for about 50 years. He told his favorite story about Robert Lincoln to a newspaper. He said, "One day 7 or 8 years ago, I was talking with Mr. Lincoln inside one of the big windows of the Chicago Club on Michigan Avenue when a military parade passed by. For some reason, they stopped within our view for several minutes, and as we watched them, Mr. Lincoln laughed softly, and he told me a story. 'This reminds me of Father,' he said. 'He was always eager when he saw marching troops to know what state they came from. Once, as we were driving through Washington, our carriage was stopped by a body of troops crossing a corner. In his eagerness to know from where they hailed, Father opened the door and, stepping halfway out, shouted to a group of workmen standing close by, 'What is it, boys?' Meaning, where did they come from? One short little red-haired man with a typical Irish face affixed him with a withering glance and retorted, 'It's a regiment, you damned old fool.' In a fit of laughter, Father closed the door, and when his mirth had somewhat subsided, he turned to me and said, 'Bob, it does a man good sometimes to hear the truth.'" And so what is the truth about Robert Lincoln? Well, quite simply, he was a great man in his own right, separate from his father, which is in fact why his wife buried him in Arlington National Cemetery and not in the Lincoln Tomb in Springfield, Illinois. She thought that he deserves his own place in the sun, as she said. So why is Robert's reputation so negative? I know you all thought I forgot. I promised I would tell you. There's really 3 reasons. One is that Robert, as a captain of industry and a millionaire businessman, he has the impression and the reputation as a kind of a cold, ruthless, avaricious CEO. He didn't like people. He was out of touch with the common man. That was really the thing. His father was common, but Robert, he disdained the common man. And part of that was Robert's own fault. He didn't like talking to the press because he felt that they just made stuff up in the paper. But since he wouldn't talk to them, they would just make it up. So then he wouldn't talk to them. So it's kind of this cycle. The second reason is Robert's commitment of his mother to the mental institution in 1875, which has been cast as, he bribed the judge and the jury. It's a kangaroo court. He wanted to steal her money. All this ridiculous nonsense. I know where it came from, but it's nonsense. But, it persists in the face of cold evidence that it didn't really happen that way. But really the third reason, and probably the most important reason for Robert's negative reputation, it all comes down, sadly, to one book. One single book really did it all. It's a 1987 biography of Mary Lincoln called Mary Todd Lincoln, A Biography by Jean Baker. Now the book is a feminist, revisionist psychobiography, labeled by others than me, although I agree with it. But if you read that book, Robert is the most disgusting, despicable, heartless, horrible human being that you could ever possibly imagine roamed the earth. Well, actually, Baker did imagine it because it's all false. But that's been the go-to book on Mary for decades, and so that's become Robert's reputation. That's interesting, though, that she's lucky that none of Robert's family or that his law firm were alive at the time, because they would have sued her for libel. Actually, one interesting thing I found out during my research was that there was a book published in 1959 called The Trial of Mary Todd Lincoln by 2 authors, Rhodes and Jockius. And it was the true story of Mary Lincoln's trial. And then you open up the flap, it's the true story as it should have been. And so it's basically, they just made it all up. Robert bribed the judge and the jury, kangaroo court, he's stealing her money, blah, blah, blah. But it was cast as nonfiction and truth. So Robert's law firm, Isham, Lincoln and Beale, was still in existence at that time. And one of the vice presidents, who was also the firm historian, he read the book, and he personally had known Robert Lincoln. And he wrote them a letter to the 2 authors and the publisher, and he said, "I've just read your book. Everything in it is a malicious lie. And if you do not pull every copy of that book off every shelf in America, we will destroy you." And it's amazing. If you look at every edition of that book after the first one, it's now labeled as fiction. So there is a little justice in the world, I guess. So, when I wrote my book, my goal was never to vindicate Robert Lincoln or to try to actively seek to restore his reputation. I just thought that he seemed like a very interesting guy who had never really been written about before. But the more I learned about him, the more I learned that he was really a great man. And his life really needs to be understood, especially for what it was and not what it has become perceived to be. Towards the end of his life, Robert Lincoln, one time he was at the Georgetown golf course. Golf was one of his great passions, as was smoking cigars. And he was sitting there smoking a cigar after a run of golf. And a reporter came up to him and wanted his picture, wanted an interview. And Robert, no, I don't want it. And the guy just kept bothering. Finally, Robert turned to him and he said, listen, my father was a great man, but I am not. And he got up and walked away. Now, I, for one, would respectfully disagree. Thank you very much. Love to take questions. Yes, ma'am.
Does he have any heirs at this point?
Any heirs left? No. Robert had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. His son, Abraham Lincoln II, whom they called Jack, died when he was 16 of blood poisoning. His daughter, Mary, his oldest daughter, Mary, Isham, she got married. She had 1 son, Abraham Lincoln Isham. They called him Link. And Jessie Beckwith, Jessie Lincoln, Robert's smallest, his youngest child, was she was kind of the wild child of the Lincoln family. She eloped with a football player. Robert locked her in her room for 2 days. It was all in the media. She had 2 children, Robert and Mary Beckwith. And so Robert had those 3 grandchildren. And all 3 of them, as far as I can determine, purposefully did not have children. They all hated being Lincolns. They felt that it was a curse. They felt like they were sideshow freaks. And they didn't want to pass it on to another generation. So Bud Beckwith, the last one, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, they called him Bud, he died in 1985, and he was the last direct descendant. Yes, sir.
Yes, 3 pieces.
Yes, sir.
Could you talk about Robert's connection to the Lincoln Memorial,
Mm-hmm.
His house in Georgetown, and the Georgetown golf course?
Yes. Yeah, Robert, he lived in Chicago for 50 years, and in 1911, he spent a lot of time in Washington, politics, his law practice, what have you. And his wife and his daughter, Jessie, she got divorced, and she basically lived with her parents, with her 2 kids for a couple of decades, I think. And Jessie and Robert's wife's name was also Mary, 4 Marys in the Lincoln family. They wanted to move to Washington, so they bought a house, I think it was 2013 N Street in Washington in 1911, and they owned that until Mary Harlan Lincoln died in 1936. And Robert was very sad. They lived in Chicago for 50 years, but I've seen some interesting newspaper articles. Robert would just walk the streets. He was just a normal guy. He just wanted to kind of be a normal guy. And so every once in a while, the Washington Post or the Washington Star would say, sometimes you'll see a very quiet elderly gentleman with a white beard and a hat walking the streets of Georgetown, and nobody would know that's the son of Abraham Lincoln. So yeah, actually, the Robert's house ultimately was bought by Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. I think he might still own it, or his wife. I'm not sure. But no, Robert had quite a connection to Washington. The Lincoln Memorial, Robert was intricately involved in its creation for 20 years. The idea started in 1901, and Robert, he knew everybody in Washington, politicians, generals, everybody. One reason because he worked in Washington, but also because everybody wanted to know him because he was the son of Abraham Lincoln. And so, but he was actively involved. He believed, he never got involved in anything about his father, any statues or anything. But the Lincoln Memorial he did. He felt that that was kind of the one great thing that he wanted to contribute to. And so, it kind of got started. It kind of stopped for a while, started and stopped. And ultimately, when it really got underway in the late teens, early 20s, former President Taft was the head of the commission, and he and Robert were friends. So Robert would ask him how it was going. He would help him. He would talk to politicians. Robert offered to give money occasionally for things, although he wanted it kept out of the papers. But he visited Daniel Chester French's studio and gave him tips on the statue of his father. And actually, most artists for the 60 plus years that Robert lived after the assassination, they did their stuff about Abraham Lincoln and they never consulted Robert. And Robert actually, I once read a letter that he wrote saying, the Lincoln Memorial is wonderful And, Mr. French did a great job because he listened to me when I told him how my father looked. Nobody else has ever listened to me, and that's why I hate all the art about my father. So Robert actually got a pass that he and anybody he brought could tour the memorial as it was under construction at any time, day or night, which one of his great prides was to bring people up there and say, this is where my father's going to be. So, yeah, and then he joined the Georgetown Golf Club. I think he belonged to a couple of clubs around here. He loved golf. He played every day, as much as he could, I should say. Until he got so old, his doctor said, I'm afraid that you're going to fall and hurt yourself and you need to stop playing golf. So, yes, sir.
This morning, my wife and I went to Arlington to see where he was buried. Could you tell us the circumstances for Robert and he wanted to be buried in Illinois?
Yes. Yeah, when Robert died, he fully expected to be buried in the Lincoln Tomb in Illinois. There was an empty crypt just for him and his wife. His son, Jack, was already buried in the Lincoln Tomb. When he died, Robert was minister to Great Britain, and they sent the body home and took it to the Lincoln Tomb. But so Robert died, and his wife, Mary, she was a very, very religious woman. She was a Christian Scientist. And I've seen the letter. She said, I've prayed and prayed for 2 weeks. And the other day I had a revelation. Our beloved one was his own great man, and he deserves his own place in the sun. And therefore I'm not going to bury him in Illinois. But because he was on Grant's staff and Secretary of War, he was entitled to Arlington. And everybody, the state of Illinois, they'd already started preparing the burial, the movement, opening the tomb, parades, everything. And the people of Illinois were furious, as you can imagine. So, but she didn't care. She said, I'm going to bury him here. And she had it, she paid for the tombstone, and she got all the requisite permissions and everything. And Jack was in the Lincoln Tomb until 1932. She didn't want them to open the tomb just for Jack. So in the 30s, the tomb was crumbling, so they had to move all the bodies so they could fix the tomb. So she said, well, since you're opening the tomb, I'm going to take my son. So they brought him to Arlington. But his name was not on Robert's stone until the early 80s, I think, because these Arlington cemetery rules for a time where no minors can be listed on a stone. So Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, the last descendant, he petitioned to get that changed. So now there's a little tombstone that says AL second on it. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could shed perhaps a little bit of light on a story that's a little bit more negative that I've heard. And this story comes out of actually a State of Illinois Historical Society, a site that's dedicated to essentially the final homestead of Thomas Lincoln, the grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And the story that's told there was a cabin in which Sarah Bush Lincoln and Thomas Lincoln lived. And after both of their deaths, other family members, Hank's family members and others, I guess, Hank's family members lived in the cabin. Then in 1893, evidently, there was a decision made to show the cabin at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And it was moved, it's a dumpy-looking cabin, moved up there, and evidently Robert Todd Lincoln saw it. Robert T. Lincoln saw it and said, well, this is awful. We can't have our family looking, and the story that I've heard, looking like a bunch of hillbillies. Right. And it was taken apart, and then last seen is a pile of lumber on Wabash Avenue. It's been reconstructed, evidently. It's been reconstructed on the site there in Loxa, Illinois. But that's maybe a more negative. Right. Have you heard this story at all?
Not that one specifically. I've heard variations of it, and I've heard a lot of stories that Robert was embarrassed by his father's roots, his grandparents, poor, that they were so poor, lived out. Actually, there's a great book by, I think it's Ed Steers, Lincoln Legends. Is that Ed Steers? Boy, Ed's going to get mad at me. I think it was Ed Steers. It's called Lincoln Legends, and it's all about the various legends of Abraham Lincoln. And one is the birthplace cabin, and it's really fascinating. The cabin, I think it was the 93 World's Fair, was the first time it was taken apart and taken to be exhibited, as was the one-room log cabin birthplace of Jefferson Davis. And they became like this traveling show. And through the years, all the wood just got mixed up together. And, they just, here's the wood, let's build a little cabin with it. So, eventually now it's in Illinois. It's probably wasn't the original when they took it in '93 anyways. I think the last I knew was that during the Civil War, some soldiers found the cabin and said, this is where the president was born. And that's the last note that I've ever seen that the original cabin was at that site. But so now what's in Kentucky or Illinois is not the original. But no, Robert, from my research, I don't think that he was embarrassed or humiliated by his grandparents' humble beginnings. There's one of the famous stories is that when Nicolay and Hay were writing their book, they basically, Hay wrote the chapter about Thomas Lincoln, and he basically said, oh, he was a dumb hick hillbilly. He liked to drink and party, and he was shiftless. He didn't really work. He beat Abraham. Abraham hated him. Horrible stuff. And Robert, he had the final say in their book. They said, we want you to look at what we write. Robert didn't ask for it, but they wanted him to do that. So, and he edited that chapter very heavily. He said, listen, he was who he was, but I feel bad for him because, how was he ever to know that he now has to stand next to the shadow of his great son? So we can't really be too harsh on the guy. He lived then. He did the best he could. Now, history has shown that Thomas Lincoln was not a drunk. He didn't beat his son. He wasn't a shiftless ne'er-do-well. He was actually a hardworking farmer who was pretty successful. So I've never heard that about the World's Fair, although I know Robert went to the World's Fair. I don't know. I personally tend not to believe those stories, just from everything that I've read that Robert wrote about his grandparents or his father's early childhood. And actually, most of the time, especially in 1909, a lot of school kids wrote to Robert, can you tell me about your father and what can I learn from your father? Always, almost every letter, Robert said, what you can learn from my father is that it doesn't matter where you come from, you can become the President of the United States if you work hard and you believe in yourself. He started with a dirt floor and he ended up in the White House. So he was very proud of that, actually, that his father, self-taught, had ascended that high. So, yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about Robert's relationship, Lincoln and his mother's life? How estranged were they? Those kinds of things.
Sure. Yeah, Robert and his mother were incredibly close. And there's a book came out last year called The Mary Lincoln Enigma. That's a bunch of essays about Mary, and I wrote one about Mary and Robert's relationship. And I argue in that, I say, I think Mary was closer to Robert than she was to Abraham in many ways. During the Illinois years, Lincoln was gone 6 to 9 months of the year riding the judicial circuit and doing politics. Robert was always home. He was really his mother's best friend. He was her confidant. She was terrified of robbers and lightning. He was the one that she always clung to. When Eddie died, when he was 4, Robert was 7, he was the one Mary clung to. He was the one that dealt with her and her grief. Lincoln rode off on the circuit. And so they were incredibly close. All their letters attest to this. After the assassination, they remained close. Mary's letters all constantly say, Robert is the greatest son who's ever lived. And she ultimately bestows upon him the greatest compliment she can. She says, he grows more and more every day like his sainted father. After Robert had his mother committed, of course, Mary got a little upset. She thought one of her many symptoms was she was paranoid. And she thought she was also obsessed and deluded about money. She always thought she was on the brink of poverty. And she thought he was trying to steal her money, which is where that accusation comes from. That's what Mary thought, which is not true. But basically, she wouldn't forgive him for it. So she was in the mental institution for 4 months. She was in the Edwards home in Springfield for another 9 months, under court order, but in their house. When she was declared restored to sanity, a few months later, she went to Europe in a self-imposed exile. And she and Robert did not speak for 5 years. And Robert, many letters that I've seen, that I think I have them all in this book here, he was heartbroken. In letters, he said, someone just asked me where my mother is, and I said, she's somewhere in Europe, I don't know, because she won't speak to me. And Robert's aunt, Elizabeth Edwards, who was Mary's sister, she kept urging Robert, you should mend fences, mend fences. And finally, Robert wrote her a letter. He said, I have nothing against my mother. I will speak to her tomorrow and not blame her for anything, because I know it wasn't her fault, but she won't speak to me. So finally, in 1881, Mary came back from Europe in 1880. She was very poor in health, back problems, leg problems. She was going blind. I'm sure she missed her family as well. She came back. In 1881, Robert was Secretary of War, and he went from Washington to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to inspect the fort. And on his way out there, he stopped in Springfield and spoke to his mother for the first time. And we don't know. My guess is that Elizabeth Edwards arranged the meeting, but we know that Robert would have done it. I think she probably smoothed out Mary to eventually accept talking to Robert. So after they reconciled, Robert visited her about every 2 weeks, and then she spent 6 or 8 months in New York getting medical treatment. And when she was in New York, he and his family visited her every week until she died. So they mended fences, but it's really sad to read the letters, and she was so angry at him, which is, when I wrote this book, I spoke with many psychiatric medical experts, and my main expert, he said he had a case just like this. A woman clearly had, various issues, schizophrenia or something. Her son had her committed against her will. Nowadays, she was committed for 2 weeks for observation. She was given medication, and the medication evened her out. And the doctor told me, he said, she admits to me, yes, I needed help. The medication is helping me. I feel great. But she never forgave her son for having her committed, even though she knows it was the right thing. So it's very sad. Yes, sir.
There's been so much speculation and discussion over the years about what Abraham Lincoln's voice sounded like. And sadly, we'll never know. But are there audio recordings of Robert Lincoln? And also, is there any film of him?
Not that I've seen. I have to admit, after my book was done, I stumbled across a reference in the Columbia University Library collections of a supposed recording of Robert Lincoln. But I honestly haven't had time to go look into it. So supposedly there is. That's the only thing I've ever found. He was at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, so there is, I think, video footage of that. And obviously there's a lot of photographs. But I think there's video of him when he arrived and when he walked up the steps with the military, helped him up there, wearing a top hat that I discovered within the last year or two that was probably one of his father's hats that he wore there, kind of an homage to his father, which is pretty neat. But I think Daniel Day-Lewis probably pegged Lincoln's voice pretty great in the movie. It was uncanny how amazing he was as Lincoln. I've been studying Lincoln for 20 years. I mean, that was Lincoln. It was just crazy. Yes, sir.
Did you run across any interesting communications between he and Theodore Roosevelt, or any observations by him on Roosevelt?
Yes, many. Roosevelt revered Abraham Lincoln, and so he wanted to get to know his son, Robert Lincoln. Robert had met him multiple times in Washington. Trying to think of the chronology here, so I'm correct. They had many. When McKinley was shot, Robert was on his way to Buffalo. He was not in Buffalo. He got to Buffalo. He went to the Milburn House, and as he came out, he met with Vice President Roosevelt, and he said, thank God the president's okay. Of course, all the doctors, he'll be fine, don't worry about it. And so he had a brief chat with Roosevelt, and then, of course, the president died. Robert wrote him a wonderful letter. I think it's here, actually, in the Roosevelt papers, in the manuscript room, where he said, when I saw you that day outside of the Milburn House, neither one of us had expected the president to die. I will not congratulate you for becoming the president, because I know better than anybody what a horrible job that is, and I don't envy you your position. So they became somewhat friends. They wrote occasional letters, and Robert went to the White House for functions occasionally. During Roosevelt's, I think his bid for election in 2004, I think it was, he started claiming the mantle of Lincoln for his progressive policies. Robert was a conservative Republican all his life, diehard conservative Republican, what a Republican was at that time. And he was furious, and he publicly wrote letters saying, Colonel Roosevelt doesn't know what he's talking about. My father would be aboard if he knew that this man is claiming his mantle. And they had a little public spat in the newspapers, and Roosevelt basically said, well, Robert doesn't know what he's talking about. I know who I am. But then they cleared that up, and actually, really fascinating story I found during my research, the 1912 presidential nominating convention, Roosevelt, Taft, and whomever, somebody else. Anyways, Taft and Roosevelt were trying to maneuver each other out of the nomination, and Roosevelt, he tried to finagle a group of members to nominate Robert Lincoln for president. That was the 5th time. And Robert was 60-something. He said, listen, I don't want to be president, but I can tell you right now, if I were to get the job, it would kill me because I'm not in good health, and no thanks. Roosevelt's ploy failed. His delegate could not get in there to nominate Robert Lincoln, but it's kind of an interesting thing to know what may have happened if he had actually gotten into the hall. So they had a very interesting relationship. Roosevelt thought Robert was one of the best ministers to Great Britain that he had ever seen in his adult life. So, yes, sir. With Taft? Yeah, they were very good friends. Actually, Taft was the first American president to really play golf, and Robert was an avid golfer. And so they became golfing buddies, and Taft went to Hildene a number of times, basically just to play golf. Robert supported him for re-election, gave money to his campaign, invited him to Manchester, Vermont during the campaign. I think he voted for him. He always admired Taft, thought he was a good president, thought he was a good Supreme Court justice. But it was, kind of it was more than an acquaintance, but not a deep friendship. They knew each other. I mean, I think their real connection was golf, mostly. But at that time, Robert really hated Teddy Roosevelt, so he very vociferously supported Taft. Questions? Yes, sir.
I've read your book.
Thank you. I
Very
appreciate
well
that. Thank you.
Very enjoyable to read. Learned a lot in that book, and I really appreciate you doing it. 2 things, though. What was his wife's, Mary's, illness? She seemed to be sick quite a long time in her life, and you never quite said what she had. And then the other was with the talk of Mary Lincoln, or Mary Todd Lincoln, that with the insanity trial, that couple from Chicago. Oh my
Right.
God.
The Bradwells.
Could you just speak a little bit about those?
Sure, yeah. Robert's wife, Mary Harlan Lincoln, was a very sickly woman, always sick, as was her mother, actually. And I never say what her illness is because I actually don't know. Robert was a private person. His wife was maniacally private person. And I think she also had some social anxiety disorder too. She hated public events. And so I actually don't know. It's just she was always sick. Or else she was with her mother who was sick, so she was caring for her mother. And then she was always sick. And then she and her mother, they'd be sick together, and they'd go out to they'd go to the Rocky Mountains to recover. And so, yeah, but it actually was about the 1880s or so. So throughout the 70s and 80s, she was sick all the time. And then after about the 1880s, that sickness really drops way off. And I don't know if she grew out of something. She may have found actually a doctor who actually knew what he was doing. I'm not sure. But she still had a lot of illnesses throughout her life. But nothing like that decade, 70 to 80, was pretty awful. And a lot of people have said, well, she was an alcoholic. You may have heard that. I think that came from Gene Baker's book as well. Not one shred of proof for that. And I've searched through the entire Hildene house. The Hildene historian searched through the entire house. No bottles, no receipts, no records, no letters, no nothing. But Peggy Beckwith, Robert's granddaughter, has a membership card to Alcoholics Anonymous. So apparently that's the proof that Peggy was, therefore Mary Harlan was drunk. So I don't know. She was just sick. Now the second part was the insanity. Oh, the Bradwells. Yeah, the Bradwells were a pretty interesting couple. They were both lawyers. Myra Bradwell was a feminist, an abolitionist, amazingly brilliant woman. But I think that they were just out for themselves. They played it like they were trying to protect Mary from Robert, but really they were just getting their own publicity. They ran a newsletter, and he was a political official. And then after Mary got out, they didn't speak to her for, I think, over a year. Now, one thing I theorize in my book, there may have been some kind of an agreement between them and Robert, where Robert said, I will let her go if you just go away, which would make sense. But I think that they were kind of self-serving opportunists myself. And yet they were also her friends. Eventually they all reconnected, and up until the about 1880, I think was the last letter I saw. They actually corresponded, and the Bradwell's granddaughter inherited numerous items that Mary Lincoln had given Myra Bradwell, and she gave them a lot to Chicago and some to Springfield, Illinois. Supposedly the pen that Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, supposedly she had that. There was a big thing. Someone else said, "No, I've got the pen. You don't have the pen." Such a sordid world, you know. No, so they were interesting people. But it was through their descendant that I actually found the trunk full of Mary's letters from the asylum that had been missing for almost 100 years that I found, was through their descendant, their last living descendant. He had some documents about it that led me on the trail. So. Yes, sir.
I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but I've heard that Robert Lincoln held back some of his father's papers for release years after most of them were released. And so my question is, number one, is that accurate? And number two, if it is, why?
Well, when he donated the papers to the Library of Congress, he had a stipulation in there that the papers could not be publicly opened for, 27 years? 21 years until after he had died, or after he had died. And that was, there's been a lot of theories about it. He was trying to deny access to people, historians, whatever. Basically as a Victorian gentleman, and he puts it right in the document, he says, there are things in here that could be embarrassing or damaging to people who are still living or to their children. And I don't want to put them through that. So by that time, they'll all be dead, and then we can all see the papers. So now, after he died, his family still owned a ton of stuff from the Lincoln family. So Mary Harlan Lincoln donated a number of items to the Library of Congress after Robert's death. After she died, her daughter Mamie, Mary Isham, donated items. Her son Lincoln Isham donated items. The two Beckwith children, I don't know that they ever did. They really didn't care about being Lincoln. So that was just that one, just to protect people who might be referenced in the papers. So. Should I cut it off? All right. Thank you all so much. I'm sorry. I could talk forever. All right. Yes, I can just keep talking all day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.